When I first started my job at my university, I went for a walk to get to know the local area. Okay, really, I was scoping out my caffeine options, and there's a local strip near campus with a Starbucks and a few shops and restaurants. Happily caffeinated, I headed back to my new office, but paused when I saw a large sign in the window of a small restaurant. It said, quite simply, "Best breakfast in town." That was it, those 4 words. The next day, I went to this local place to try their breakfast. While I was there, I looked around for framed newspaper clippings or plaques indicating awards, anything to justify the sign in the window. But there wasn't anything there. Later, I looked up the restaurant online to see if, despite the absence of physical evidence, there were other accolades to report. I couldn't find any, not a single award, not even #1 on TripAdvisor. We know by now in this course that making a claim without evidence is unacceptable. But still, what a powerful claim. It's simple and evocative, and it worked. After all, I ate breakfast there the very next day. It's pretty good, by the way. I recommend the omelets. This is the power of a good headline. Taking a claim and communicating it effectively is the last but perhaps most important step in the research process. No matter what your project is, you have a choice. Let it die in the dustbins of your file cabinet unread, or share it with those who might benefit from it. Now, in the case of this particular restaurant, they skipped over the whole do research part of everything and went straight to communicating. If you think about it, this is the same process as what's behind accusations of fake news, reporting claims, true or made up, with no evidence. And fake news is not, shall we say, good research. But it persists in part because the claims can be very powerful. How many of us have clicked on provocative headlines that lead to stories that are quite banal? I read one the other day that said, "This dog cried out in joy. You won't believe what happened next." I thought it would be another heartwarming story of a veteran reunited with a dog from his or her time in service. Instead, it was just a video of a dog making a silly noise. Yes, even I can fall prey to clickbait. Here's what we need to keep in mind. Communicating information effectively and drawing people in to hear what we have to tell them, this is a skill. We need to put just as much thought into how we talk about our findings as we have into creating those findings in the first place. We know from the earliest lessons of this course that research should be shared. Our incremental piece of the puzzle should be added to the larger whole, and the only way to do that is to share our findings with others. The first thing we have to do is figure out who our intended audience might be. Your audience is whoever you want to know about your findings. That might be a supervisor, your family, community stakeholders, potential donors, grant institutions, policymakers, scholars, students, or the general public. The type of communicating that you do is highly dependent on this audience. How you write a scholarly article intended for other researchers is very different from how you might write a lecture for students, a presentation for local government officials, or a memo to your boss. Let's use an example to illustrate. Let's say you did a study on whether or not dog ownership makes people happier, and your results show that this is generally the case. If you want to publish your research in a peer-reviewed journal, you'll need to write up a formal journal article that meets all the specifications of the specific journal you want to send it to. If instead you want potential adopters at your local dog shelter to know about this, you might write a blog entry for their website or help them develop an ad campaign. And if you just want regular people on social media to know, then you create a clickbait headline like "This dog cried out in joy, you won't believe what happened next." I'll be your first reader, I promise. If you don't think through your audience, your work probably won't get read. As we've discussed before, this is at the heart of accusations against the ivory tower of academia, that scholars write for themselves and each other, and little of what they do is aimed at the general public. It's a fair critique, and there are some efforts to try to make scholarly work more available and palatable to the public. But you can face this risk outside of scholarly circles too. I'll give you an example. One time I was asked to put together a proposal to send to my boss on restructuring my department's administrative responsibilities. I spent days on this report, crunching numbers and preparing the data, and I crafted a beautiful and detailed 7-page proposal with tables and charts. I was really proud of it. A week later, I went to a meeting with my boss to discuss the report. He sat down with his freshly printed version, flipped through it briefly, and then tossed it on the table. He said, "I didn't have time to read this. What's your proposal?" I thought we were going to discuss the nuances of everything I wrote, dig into the details, admire the charts. Instead, I had to throw together a verbal presentation of this information with zero preparation. I should have thought more about my audience. My boss is very busy and didn't have time to read my report. I should have spent less time on that document as it wasn't the right way to communicate my data. I should have had a 1-page handout with just the key points listed. As it happens, I'm pretty good on my feet, and he ended up accepting the proposal. But don't make my mistake. Prepare to communicate with your audience in mind. Once you've figured out your audience, it's time to start crafting your communication. Often research is shared in a formal report, but don't feel limited by that. Formal reports can be dry and filled with jargon that's difficult for a general audience to process. There are plenty of more informal formats you can use to communicate your results. I've already mentioned blog entries, social media, and ad campaigns. Other options include newspaper articles and podcasts. But you may find that something even more creative is in order, and look to the arts by presenting your findings in the form of dance, song, poetry, drawings, and plays. Consider the impact of the musical Hamilton on generating enthusiasm for learning more about the founding of the United States. We're going to focus here on how to craft a formal research report, however, as that's probably the most unfamiliar to you. Writing a formal report can also help you prepare for less formal communications. It's generally a lot easier to take formal writing and make it more consumable than to go the other way. Here are the key sections of a typical research report: front matter, introduction, literature review, theory, methodology, discussion of results, conclusion, and references. Let's look at each of these. First, you have the front matter. This is all the information you include before getting into your writing. This will consist of the title page, acknowledgements, abstract, and if necessary, table of contents. Your title page should include, at a minimum, the title of your report and the names and affiliations of all the authors. It may also include the venue for the report, such as the name of a conference or meeting, as well as the date. Conventions depend on your discipline and preferred style guide, so consult examples to see how you should format yours. For example, in some fields, the titles are long and incredibly descriptive, while in others, short, clever titles are common. If you aren't sure, go for a combo. Use something short and pithy, put in a colon, and then a more descriptive subtitle. For example, I might title a paper about this great course like this: A Method for My Madness, colon, teaching the course research methods for any project. Next are your acknowledgements. This can be a separate page in a longer report or thesis, but it may appear on the title page or in footnotes. There are a few acknowledgements you should consider. If you received funding or other forms of financial or technical support for any part of your research, you should note that here. It's also common to thank those who provided feedback, either those who gave comments on an earlier draft or anonymous reviewers. If you need to include a disclaimer about your work and any conflicts of interest, that should go here too. You might need to note that your work is entirely your own and doesn't represent the views of your employer, for example. Finally, in longer projects, such as a dissertation or book, people will thank their families, editors, and others who provided more emotional forms of support. That's typically not done in a typical research report, though. Next up is the abstract. This is a short summary of main claims, approach, and findings of your research. Typically, it's a paragraph, and while length can vary by field and venue, 300 words is a good length to aim for. In some types of reports, this is a full executive summary of several pages. Regardless, the main idea is that if readers only have time to read the abstract or executive summary, they can still get a good sense of what you did. Finally, in a longer report, you should include a table of contents. In academic work, this is typically only done in theses or book-length projects. Use your judgment on whether a table of contents is necessary. If the sections or chapters are a page or two each, or there's only a handful of them, it's probably safe to skip it. Once we're done with the front matter, we're ready for the beginning of our actual report, the introduction. The introduction has to do at least two things. First, it needs a hook. You need to convince readers quickly that your report is worth reading. They need to understand the puzzle, problem, or question that's driving your research and why they, as readers, should care about it. This might involve telling a relevant anecdote or putting your project into its broader context so people can see what's at stake. Don't assume your readers will care about your project just because you do. If we're back to our story about dogs and happiness, maybe this is where you tell a story about how a veteran's PTSD symptoms improved after she adopted a dog. If you're writing about climate change, some doom and gloom examples of the ferocity of recent hurricanes can help raise the stakes. This is where you might give the normative motivation behind your empirical work. Second, you should be upfront about your claims and findings. If the first thing you do is lay out your question or puzzle to hook a reader's interest, the second thing you do is reveal your answer. Don't be coy or toy with your readers and make them read the whole report to find out what you've concluded. Your report isn't an Agatha Christie mystery novel with Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple waiting at the end to reveal all. It's essentially a defense of your claims. You make your claim and then everything else reveals how you got there. It might not make for a great mystery novel, but the best research papers don't throw up smoke and mirrors to distract their readers. Tell us early on what you found. There are other things that can go in an introduction, of course. I like to include a roadmap, for example, that lays out what readers can expect in the rest of the report, section by section. But as long as you lay out the puzzle or hook and state your claims, you're off to a good start. The next section of a research paper is your literature review. We covered literature reviews in Lecture 5. Here's where you put all that cocktail party knowledge to good use. This section lays out the scope of the existing scholarly literature on your research question. This demonstrates not only your familiarity with what we already know, but provides evidence that more work, your work, is necessary. The literature review can also lay the groundwork for your theory, hypotheses, and methodology section by showing that your decisions in those areas are built on the backs of previously published work. Now keep in mind that a good literature review isn't organized by source, but by topic. It's not simply a discussion of author 1 followed by author 2. Instead, you pull out the necessary themes or theoretical paradigms that need to be discussed to explain the roots of your own ideas, and then effectively put the authors in conversation with one another. Your goal is to identify and enter debates and fill gaps, so this conversation is necessary to show where those debates and gaps are. In our dog happiness study, this might mean bringing together the work of 10 different psychologists to compare their perspectives on how constant canine companionship can affect mood levels, before you turn to those who, for example, study stress or PTSD in particular, if that's your specific focus. At some point, if your research is theory-driven, as a lot of positivist research is, you'll need a section to discuss your theory. This might come directly out of the literature review itself, or be its own section or chapter. This is where you build the theoretical basis for your claims and hypotheses before you convey what the data says. Basically, this is where you explain why you tested what you did and why we should logically expect to see certain results from those tests. Now, not all work is driven by or testing theory, however, so you might skip this section if it doesn't apply. Next up is the methodology section. Remember our characteristics of good research and how we said that good research is, amongst other things, systematic, empirical, and transparent? In the methodology section, we transparently report on the systematic and empirical practices we engaged in to achieve our results. All of the choices you've made throughout the research process are reported here. You should describe all of your methods, your overall approach, mode of data collection, your population and sample, sources of data, analysis procedures, all of it goes here. If you conducted interviews or a survey, you can list the questions here or in an appendix. If your project was examined by an institutional review board for ethics, you should note that somewhere in this section and that you received the board's approval. But it's not enough to simply list what you did. You also need to justify your choices and discuss any limitations to your methods. Why was a survey the best way to go for this project? Why these cases or that sampling method? Lay it all out here. If you're writing a grant proposal, by the way, this is the point at which your proposal will probably end, except for a section on budgets and timelines. After all, you can't actually carry out your methodology without funding, so it's difficult to move on to a results section. Everything to this point, except noting your actual findings in the introduction, can probably be written prior to carrying out the data gathering and analysis. Next up is your discussion of results section. This is the meat of the paper and what everyone's ultimately interested in. It's where you clearly describe the results of your data analysis, whether that's qualitative or quantitative. This could take the form of multiple case studies, each with their own section or chapter, or the discussion of the core concept from grounded theory, or a series of tables and charts describing the results of your quantitative analysis. The key here is to make sure that you're including the appropriate amount of detail and evidence for your audience. A scholarly audience is going to expect much more detailed results and discussion than a general public audience. Keep that in mind, particularly as you prepare any tables and charts. Including the readout from a regression analysis is fine for scholars, but a more general audience might struggle with interpreting R-squared or beta coefficients. So you need to give an appropriate level of explanation for your audience. Now, some disciplines include a separate discussion section after the results where researchers discuss the implications of their results. Others include that discussion in the results section itself. Your review of the literature will tell you what the norm is in your field, but keep in mind that you can't have just one or the other. You need both to report your results themselves and discuss their meaning and implications. The final written section is your conclusion. Conclusions typically do three things. First, they summarize the key points of the paper. Basically, a reader should be able to read the introduction and conclusion of a paper and have a pretty strong understanding of everything you did. This summary shouldn't be long, but it should remind readers of what they've learned. Next, the conclusion should discuss the implications of these findings for the broader normative context. Now that we have empirical findings, what does this mean for the world or your particular problem or community? What policies or practices should change as a result? In other words, what recommendations for action would you make based on your findings? This is the other time in a paper when it's perfectly okay to make normative statements. Finally, a good conclusion can also note the next steps in the research program. Now that we know this new piece of information, what's the next question or puzzle that's raised? Given the limitations on the claims that we were able to make, what next steps would allow us to say just a little bit more? Remember, science is incremental and we've just added a small piece. So what's the next small piece of the puzzle that we need? Once the conclusion is done, all that's left is the references page. Different disciplines use different styles. Those of the Modern Language Association, the American Psychological Association, the Chicago Manual of Style, and others. But the key is simply to list in the appropriate style all of the references cited in the report. This is typically a works cited page, not works consulted. If you didn't end up citing it, generally shouldn't appear on the list. Make sure you properly credit all your sources throughout the report with citations. And in some disciplines and style guides, you'll use footnotes or endnotes rather than a references page. So again, look to the literature for the most common choices in your area. So that's the formal report. A presentation will include much of that same information, just in an oral or visual format. If you're giving an oral presentation, you'll want to hit the same points, but unless your workplace or discipline calls for a written script, your style will probably be a bit more relaxed. If possible, have visual aids for your audience. Don't overwhelm them with text. Use a few keywords, phrases, or quotes, and rely more heavily on pictures, tables, and graphs that you can then talk about. As with the written report, make sure your tables and charts look neat and professional. If your chosen method of communication is less formal, you'll probably drop the literature review and methodology sections and simply refer to those if people ask, or put them in an online appendix. A press release for a poll, for example, will lay out some information about the methodology behind the poll, but the full methodology is typically referenced in a link. Blogs or social media posts, podcasts, press releases, op-eds, these are going to focus more on your claims, your evidence, and why people should care. Be prepared to answer questions about everything else, but those should be the main thrust of what you communicate. Let me give you a few writing tips. First, writing can be a very messy and non-linear process. Don't feel like you need to start with the title or introduction and move straight through. I tend to write my introductions last, in fact. Consider working from an outline and writing each part as inspiration strikes you. This is the last lecture in this course, but it was actually the 7th one that I created. The first lecture in the course was one of the last ones that I worked on. As our qualitative researchers show in the ways that they use the scientific method, linearity can be overrated. Second, be prepared to revise, revise, revise. Research itself is constantly subject to revision as we receive feedback, and writing is absolutely the same. Don't assume your first draft will be perfect. A colleague of mine won an award for best paper in her area of research, and it was rejected for publication the first 6 times she submitted it for review. It was only through that constant revision process that it was eventually accepted and properly rewarded. Finally, if you want to include graphics in your work that were created by someone else, make sure they're either available through a Creative Commons license or that you have permission of the rights holder to use them, and cite accordingly. Okay, so you've put together your report, presentation, review, email, or blog post. Now it's time to click send and share it with the world. As we've discussed, research should be publicly shared to further the pursuit of knowledge or to show your funders, boss, or client that you carried out the project to completion. Nevertheless, hitting send can be a very nerve-wracking process. Sharing our findings makes us vulnerable. It invites criticism and rejection, as well as praise and acceptance. It's normal if you feel anxious about sharing your work. That's okay. And sometimes you're conducting research entirely for yourself and you don't want to share it. That's okay too. But if you follow the guidelines in this course, I would encourage you to share your findings. If you've done good work, there are others out there who might benefit from it. And keep in mind that review by others is a required step toward your work making a difference. It's not enough for you to think you've done a good job designing and carrying out your research. Stakeholders and other interested parties need to weigh in on whether your work has merit and should be considered a new part of the scholarly literature. The formal version of this process is called peer review. We discussed peer review earlier when we talked about how to identify a scholarly source, but now it's time for your work to undergo peer review. In a scholarly academic journal, this is a very formal process. You submit an article wiped clean of any identifying information, and an editor sends it to a few experts in that area to read and review. Those reviewers aren't identified to you, but will provide comments and a recommendation on whether or not your work is worthy of publication. This double-blind process is certainly not perfect. There's a long history of hoax papers being accepted for publication, in fact, but it can help ensure that good work is disseminated regardless of who produced it. We see less formal kinds of peer reviews all the time. Restaurant reviews, product testing reports, movie critic recommendations. All of these are people reviewing the quality of work of other people. The reviewers aren't necessarily colleagues of the people whose work they're reviewing or experts, but their opinions may matter nevertheless. So how do you avoid getting drowned in negative comments or having your work rejected by reviewers? Well, before you share your work widely, let a few trusted people take a look. Family members, friends, colleagues, mentors. They may be able to spot errors or confusion in your writing. You can even hire a professional copy editor to help you punch up your writing if you want. Second, make sure whatever you're writing fits squarely within the aims and scopes of the audience to whom you plan to submit it. In other words, it's not enough to think through your audience, you also have to consider your venue. In the case of academic journals, for example, some are more likely than others to accept qualitative work. Third, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Review is just another form of feedback, and it can help you improve your work. Nothing's ever perfect. Share your work often and then incorporate the feedback into the next draft. Or don't. If you don't agree with the feedback or critique, stick to your guns and stand behind what you wrote. So finally, have confidence in your own work, but recognize you're always going to run into critique, criticism, and rejection. Try not to let it wear you down. One of my favorite authors, a now best-selling fantasy novelist, had his first 6 books rejected by publishers before he finally sold one. And as for the Harry Potter books, blockbusters spawning movies and plays and amusement parks, the first one was rejected by 12 publishers, and one told author and eventual billionaire J.K. Rowling not to quit her day job. Rejection is part of the process. If you believe in your work, defend it and try again. At the same time, be prepared. Whether you're giving a formal presentation to your colleagues, boss, or peers at a conference, talking to the media, or publishing in a journal, you're likely to face questions about your work. Consider in advance what kinds of questions might be coming your way, and think about what your responses might be. Most people aren't asking questions to trip you up, but because they're genuinely interested in your findings and want to know more or understand them better. So if you can identify possible areas of confusion or elaboration early, you'll feel more comfortable in the moment fielding questions about them. Another tip is to have an elevator speech about your research. Imagine you get into an elevator at the same time as someone who you want to impress professionally. Maybe this is a senior scholar in your field, your boss, or someone whose work you admire. It's just the two of you, and the person turns to you to make conversation for the 30 seconds it takes to get to higher floors. They say, "So, tell me about your research." You have 30 seconds. What do you say? You want to have your elevator speech down cold. Your goal is to concisely explain your project, its potential value, and its findings, and to do so without making this person's eyes glaze over. Instead, you want them to walk out of that elevator with you and say, "Tell me more," or at least send you a follow-up email later. So practice this pitch. It's useful not only in the hypothetical elevator scenario, but in all kinds of everyday life scenarios when people ask you what you do for a living or how you've been lately. 30 seconds is that perfect amount of time, just enough to cover the basics and potentially prompt more conversation, but not so much that you bore someone who was only asking out of politeness. That's the essence of how to communicate your results of your hard work and your research project. Now you're equipped to undertake your own research project and report your findings. But I'd like to leave you with one last thought about research that may help you get past the jitters that many researchers feel when they're first starting out, and sometimes later in their careers as well. Always keep in mind that research is about a search for truth. So you may be scared and you may be disproven, and that's fine, because the goal isn't about being right, it's about finding an answer. So if you followed the process, it's not as scary a moment. You've checked all the boxes and you can defend what you've done. If you've been sloppy or non-systematic, that's when it's scary. Follow the procedures that we've covered and you'll earn your entry ticket to that cocktail party. You'll be a welcome part of the conversation. Others may disagree, they may even disprove your findings, and that's fine, because that brings us closer to the answers we care about, the ones we're all working toward. By the way, if you're looking for a relatively simple and useful project to start out with so you can apply the things we've learned in this course, I have a recommendation. See if you can find the best breakfast in your town. This is the project I now have all my research method students complete so they can practice their own skills. And in almost 10 years of doing this project, that place near campus with the best breakfast in town sign, it's never once won. I should probably have a chat with them about truth in advertising. Thanks for joining me. Good luck in all of your research endeavors. May your questions be interesting, your process systematic, your results significant, and your cocktail parties entertaining.